let's see.
You guys are early. What are you
Ah,
doing?
We're chatting.
hello.
I'm picking her brain because she's been doing this a long time.
She's got a good brain. She has a good brain.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Jenny. Hi, Terry.
I
Let me get organized. You guys are early. This is good.
I wouldn't have remembered, except my husband works with Malia.
Yeah, Malia Spofford.
Yeah, he works.
Xavier.
Yeah, so he works with her, and he said, "Don't forget your meeting today." And I was like, "Thank you," because I would have forgotten.
Don't tell me. You shouldn't tell me that you were going to forget it. She is spectacular. She is so, whoops, I just did something to myself. She is wonderful. I'm going to change my name. I don't like this when I'm going to rename myself. Rename Barbara.
So you're going to have this recorded in case we don't take
Yes.
notes and we could hear it again?
Yes,
Okay.
it's being
Okay.
recorded. It's being
Okay.
recorded. Let me see if I can spell my name. It's been a crazy morning already. Yep. Yeah, Jenny is an excellent tutor. I'm telling you, she's an excellent tutor. She's got terrific instincts and she'll give you good advice. She will give you good advice. She will.
Oh, that's very flattering, but thank you. I appreciate it.
It's not, you know me, I'm brutally honest. I really am. I'm brutal. I'm brutal. I am.
Oh, stop.
I am brutal. I am brutal.
No, it's just that Helena wants to know everything. Like she wants to be totally in conversation now. She's very, like you said, eager to learn. So
I
which is
told
great.
you. I told you.
Yeah,
I told you.
so-
She's wonderful. She's
Yeah, she's
wonderful.
really a cool person. So
See, the two of you are a good match.
yeah, so
Just the same as Jenny and Carmen are a good match. So
Yeah, she's great.
so it's really, hi Jody, I see you. I see your phone. This is going to be a big group today. I think I have about 20, well, if they all get here, I have about 27.
Is it an hour? An hour session?
Yeah, an
Okay.
hour. It's in between Malia. I'm very pleased that Malia agreed to do this. She's extremely busy. And she's doing it between classes.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's she sort of fit us in, which is very nice. She's one of the presidents of our board. So hi Jody.
Hello there.
Hi,
How are
Jody.
you?
Hi.
This is
Sorry.
Jody. This is
Hi.
Jody Warner Farnsworth. She is extremely experienced, an excellent tutor, an
Thank you.
excellent. Well, it's a truth.
Did you walk this morning, Jody?
I'm sorry.
Did you go out and walk this morning? It's
Oh,
Terry.
hi. How are you, Terry?
I
Yes.
said hi and you didn't acknowledge me. I was like, uh-oh.
Well, I can't see everybody. I'm on my phone rather than my big screen computer, so I can't see everyone. Sorry. Yes, I did
Okay.
this morning. It was beautiful. A little
Yeah.
chilly.
Gorgeous. Yep.
Yeah, it's really
Great.
nice out. I'm going to try to get one in later. I was totally busy this morning.
We are walking tomorrow if you want to join us, 7:30.
Okay, that might work.
Okay.
Supposed to bike at 9, so we'll see if I
Yes. So
get
how's
back.
your touring going?
It's going well. I'm enjoying it.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you joined us.
Yeah.
I am too. I am
Yeah.
too. I am
Okay.
too. She's going to be a great tutor.
It's
She'll
all,
be
thanks, it's all thanks to Jody because I would have never known about it. So
she's going to be a terrific tutor. Oh, there's Donna. Oh, Donna
Hi.
in real life. Oh, I see her
Yeah,
face.
I'm here.
Hi, Donna.
Hi.
This is going to be a big group and everybody's getting here early, which is terrific. We've got, how many here so far? We've got 9 already. Whoa. Up. There we go. I hope we're recording. I hope we really are recording.
it says recording on mine.
Oh, it
It
does?
says-
Oh, yes, yes, yes. My eyes are not functioning very well these days. I'm supposed to have eye surgery. Ugh.
Wow.
Oh, there's Jeanette. Hi, Jeanette.
Hello there.
How are you?
I am well. And you?
I'm conscious, sort of conscious, moderately conscious. I don't know. Okay, we're just awaiting Malia.
Yes.
Malia will be here shortly. She's got a tight schedule. She is so terrific. She is the best. Malia's the best. She really is. Oh, I see us recording. I did it right. I did it right.
Wait, I thought I was the best.
Well, you are, but Malia is teaching us something. So she's the fact that we could get her to teach us something is good. Because she actually is an authority. I just sort of make things up as I go.
Barbara, this is Ellen. Can you see me? Am I in okay?
Yes, you look perfectly fine. You look
Okay.
nice. You look
Just
nice.
wanted to make sure I'm in as I should be.
Yes, you are. You are in. You are in. I can see your eyeballs.
Okay.
I can see you. I can see you. This is good.
I'm half in and half out.
You're half in and half out.
I have a big
Oh,
white
Kathy,
square.
you got here. This is great.
Well,
Kathy.
yeah, except I've got maybe I could knock this little box off here. There. I think I'm here.
Yes, I hear you. I hear you. You're good.
Okay.
And nobody, and mostly all we care about. Yes. Hi.
Oh, hi. I didn't know if you could see me because I can hear you, but I didn't know if you.
I can see you, and you look very nice.
Well, thank you.
You look nice. I'd rather just, and I'm looking at your pictures behind you. I always like to look at people's pictures. All I have on, I just have my bullet. Oh, Kathy, Kathy, there's your face. I see your face, Kathy.
Oh, I don't see anything right now.
Oh, I see
I
you.
moved my screen a little bit and it went back to click open link. So let's see if I can get you back.
That's okay. We're all going to mute.
Hey, here we are.
We're going to wait for Malia. Malia's going to be coming soon.
Okay.
Okay, she'll be coming. I know
Alrighty.
she will, because she's very efficient. And the fact that everybody, now we've got 14 people.
Hi,
Wow.
Barbara.
There's
here now.
Malia. Hi. Did you hear? See how gorgeous she is? She looks
Oh.
like a well, you are. You're gorgeous. You're gorgeous. And she's brilliant too.
Oh,
And
wow.
Yeah.
It's turning out
She
to be a
is.
great meeting.
No, I have been, yeah, well, you are. So we're very fortunate to have Malia here to tell us some things, and also as the co-president of our board. And I'm serious about all of that. I mean, you know me, I have a sarcastic sense of humor, but Malia knows that. But today we're going to talk about cultural differences, which is what bonds us. Oh, there's Vicky too. Hi, Vicky. Which is what I'm going to ask most of us to mute ourselves unless we have a question to ask Malia. But Malia is going to talk about cultural differences, which is what sort of bonds us all together. The question of time, different concepts of time, and how those, when we're working with our learners, how those might affect us. Is that Billy? I don't really know Billy, but she's from Penyan. Hi, Billy. We're going to get started, and I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves, including me. So we're going to have Malia get started.
Can you enable screen sharing for me, Barbara, or whoever is logged in?
Do what?
I need screen sharing enabled from the host, who I think will be Barbara or possibly.
I just tried to do it on mine, but it said the host has to do it.
Yeah, thank you. So it's great to join all of you today. I love literacy volunteers. I've been working with literacy volunteers since 2016, shortly after I moved back to the Finger Lakes from living in Brazil for 6 years. And I know probably some of you, definitely I recognize some faces, but for others who haven't met me yet, I am an associate professor at Keuka College, and I'm also the assistant provost there. So I work with a lot of academic success, advising initiatives, general education, things like that. But in my professor role, I teach Spanish and intercultural studies. So I've taught numerous courses in intercultural communication, and it's something I think is really important for people to understand more about. And it's certainly really relevant to the tutoring role. My PhD is in the area of literature and language, so specifically Latin America. And I've lived and traveled around a lot of different places. I'm also a veteran, so I served in the U.S. Navy after college. So I'm really excited to be talking with you today, and I encourage you to ask questions. We will have time for Q&A at the end as well. But I'm going to get my slides up here soon. I think Barbara, are you sharing your screen?
It says I'm screen sharing. Does
Can
it
you
look like?
make me co-host so I can share my screen?
Let's see, make co-host, yes. Yes.
And then
Bleh,
you can
there we go.
if you stop sharing, then I can share my slides. So it will provide some visual support for what I'm talking about. Thank you.
You are welcome.
Awesome. All right. I'm excited. And were any of you at this session last year?
I think it was two years ago.
Was it 2 years ago? Oh my gosh.
Yes. See,
I'm losing track of time.
sorry. Sorry.
Time is one of those topics we will be talking about today. And I've heard from Barbara about, especially as we have a lot of refugee populations and different groups of learners coming into especially Canandaigua and Geneva. We're going to be encountering different perspectives and interactions from the teaching and learning perspective. So even though there's so much we could cover about culture, we only have an hour or so. And so I really want to focus on how we maximize that learning experience, realizing that every situation is unique and that hopefully we'll get some more tools in our toolbox and some new concepts or vocabulary that may help us frame those experiences differently. So I've already done my introduction and I'm really happy to see all of you. And when we get to Q&A time, or if you want to ask a question at any point, please introduce yourself. Let me know more about you and your role as a tutor or a volunteer and previous experiences. Because I know when we did this session before, all of our tutors come with such rich backgrounds and experiences, having lived in other countries, having worked extensively with different populations. So I'm eager for you to contribute all your ideas and thoughts as well as we go along. All right, so here's some of our objectives for today, what we're hoping to accomplish. So thinking really again about that teaching and learning relationship, gaining some vocabulary and concepts, thinking about what barriers tend to come up time and time again and some strategies to try out when we're facing those barriers. And a lot of that is self-reflection, right? Like thinking about what experiences you bring, maybe some areas where you haven't thought about yet that could be impacting communication, and really developing that positive cross-cultural mindset. Are there any questions before we get started or any comments? And hopefully I won't lose my connection. If I do, I promise I'll be right back. So just I ask for your patience. Okay, so we're going to start out with culture and identity. I think that all work we do with regards to culture starts with ourselves and thinking about our own perspectives, background, and greater self-awareness. So, a goldfish. Anybody have an idea of
I hope Malia didn't jinx herself by saying she hopes her internet.
I agree with you. I
Stable.
thought the same thing. Malia, whoops, I can text her while we're being recorded.
Sometimes we don't immediately know that we've lost the connection.
Uh-oh, she'll be back. She's not responding. She knows it.
Hey, I'm back.
Oh, good. There you
Sorry
are.
about that. I'm glad I warned you that that might happen because
Yeah.
I'm at home today, so my internet tends to be a bit mercurial.
Whoops, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I will go back to screen sharing.
Okay, please do. Am I doing it? Wait a sec.
So you need to stop screen sharing.
Yep, there I am. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I
Yep.
apologize for the interruption. So I was showing you
The goldfish.
the goldfish, and I asked if anybody had an idea of why I put the goldfish, and then nobody responded, and I realized I was no longer connected. So any thoughts on that? Probably not, right? Usually my students look at me like, what's going on? Am I in the wrong class? And so it's just a little metaphor, if you will, of the goldfish is immersed in water all the time. It needs water to breathe and live and do its goldfish things, but it doesn't realize it's wet, right? So culture in a way is like water that we are constantly immersed in, that it's part of who we are. We don't even notice it. We don't realize that we're wet in a metaphorical sense. And so when we think about identity and who we are and how we move through the world, culture is a big part of that, but we're not always aware of it. And there's some question, of course, about which comes first, right? Like it's the nature nurture argument. So does our culture impact our identity more, or do we, are we formed by our culture, or do we bring something that then creates culture? And I would say it's actually more dynamic than that it's a constant exchange and evolution. But are there any of these quotes that resonate with you? Or possibly make you think about some of your learners? So in any case, when we consider who our learners are and what they're bringing to that teaching and learning experience, we have to consider the role of culture. And we won't be aware of all of those factors, right? I was going to say we may not be aware, but we won't be aware. And that's kind of a first step. What are we bringing to the situation? How have we been shaped by all of these cultural influences that are around us? And where is our learner coming from? So while these differences will exist, they can actually be really energizing, right? Like probably part of the reason you do what you do with literacy volunteers, because you really value getting to know people from all over the world and helping them reach their greatest potential. And so this doesn't have to separate us, brings a collective strength, just like it says in this quote here. And ultimately, we're working to overcome those barriers, but also learn from them, right? Like when those barriers come up, it's an opportunity to learn more about ourselves and others and create a better relationship. So back to those quotes, thinking about, does identity come from culture, or is it, or does it create culture, or is it informed by it? And realizing when we talk about culture, there's actually a lot of categories within that. So probably you've heard of terms like subculture or microculture. It's important that when we talk about a culture, we realize that there's power dynamics involved. And so what we may call culture, like American culture, United States culture, may be the dominant culture. It may be the culture associated with a particular group. A co-culture is really another cultural group that is on par with the dominant culture. So it actually has an equal power dynamic. Whereas a subculture, we start to see maybe power differences happening. So it's a culture that's subservient in some regard to the dominant culture. Ethnicity brings in that common heritage and cultural practices. Subgroups get even more kind of down the hierarchy and may actually be more critical, say, of the dominant culture. And microcultures may just be called that because of their size. However, many people talk about we shouldn't be using these prefixes anyway, because that just emphasizes the power difference. Just to know that culture itself is very nuanced and varied. So when we're talking about culture, we should be aware that we may be referring to many, many groups all in one. Likewise, when we do talk about culture, which is very helpful, it can really help orient us. We have to be careful not to fall into, of course, stereotypes, which we'll talk about, and realizing that the individual will manifest the culture quite differently, depending. And so we will talk about active culture. So the way I manifest my cultural frameworks, right, is not going to be the same as each of you. We're each going to intersect with that differently. Furthermore, we each bring, just by the nature of how the human brain works, different perceptual bias. So bias, you know, obviously there's the kind of bias we hear about in the news all the time, right? Or we may read about, but this is really just a way our brain makes sense of reality. What information is most important? What do I need to know? What is the reality that I'm interacting with in all its complexity? How do I simplify it so I can navigate it? So this is a natural thing that we do, but how it's applied then to social situations and power dynamics can become really problematic. So accepting that we do have just this natural tendency to take shortcuts and make assumptions and things like that and not see the full picture is really important. And then being on the lookout for that, how that might manifest in something that could create barriers to communication, or also in the worst case scenario, do harm to another human being, which we definitely don't want. Along those lines, a lot of times when we talk about culture, like when I talk to students about culture, they'll immediately talk about food and clothes and rituals and holidays and things like that. And that's all true. But those are really the visible forms of culture. And so we have this model called the cultural iceberg, which you may have heard of, to draw our attention to that many, many facets of culture are actually deep structures. They're deep psychological, emotional structures, and they may not be visible at all. And they're very nuanced. And there are 10,000 different aspects to culture. So, you know, things like, you know, attitudes about death, right? Like that's not something you're going to see or even encounter very often, but they're there, right? Deep structures. Notions about wealth and how wealth is communicated. Even things that get a little more visible, like family traditions, have strong cultural components, and again, really are rooted in deeply down in identity. So all of this is going on with our learners and with ourselves in that relationship. Remembering that your culture may be undetectable to you, like the goldfish, except when you start to contrast it. You know, so if I were to take you and put you in a totally different situation in a completely different country, very quickly, you would become aware of your culture. It would start to manifest very quickly. And that's possibly what your learners are going through as they're walking down Canandaigua Main Street and wondering at, you know, what's being sold there, how cars look, or any of these tiny little things that to us perhaps are accepted and familiar, perhaps not, depending on your background. But, you know, what you bring as accepted and familiar will be different from what your learners bring. So I know this is kind of a sad picture, but I bring this because I like to draw attention to what may seem accepted and familiar to some people, like the picture on the right with the doggy on the street, which I find super sad. But when I lived in Brazil, this was a common sight. And it didn't really, nobody really noticed it much. It wasn't a big deal. And then you see the dog in the bed, which for some cultures is like, what? How could a dog be in a bed? The dog belongs outside, right? So I just bring the dog in because usually in US culture, the dominant culture, we have like a lot of affection for dogs and care for dogs, but not every culture does. And what might be accepted and familiar one place will not be in another. And you can start to become aware of your own frameworks of beliefs. So again, this is the idea, of course, of empathy and being able to put yourself in someone else's position. So that cultural relativism is a tool that you can use to dislocate yourself from your own kind of accepted and familiar environment and try to see things differently. Of course, again, we can't make assumptions. We need to get to know our learners as individuals and how they may be manifesting their culture. Are there any questions at this point or comments? Okay, feel free to.
It's quite interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of exclusive to teaching Chinese people.
Yes.
And they've brought some very interesting ideas about their culture. And I sit back and I take a look at it and listen, and I don't make any judgments, and I just accept it. That is part of their culture, and I roll with it. I don't agree with many of the things that they do. I think they're a little bit bizarre, but that's their world, and I'm not going to make any choices. I'm not going to make any decisions about being right or wrong. It's right for them, and I'm not going to say a word one way or the other. So I just thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah, we'll talk about keeping an open mind and, giving space to respond and listen rather than react, like you're saying. At the same time, and when we get to our discussion of time that Barbara asked me to focus on, I think your learners have to realize now that they are immersed in a new culture, that there will be an acculturation process, whether they engage in that fully or not at all and remain kind of fossilized in their own culture is kind of depends on the individual and the individual's characteristics, but it is a dynamic situation, a back and forth situation, and your learners should expect to change and transform to some degree. All right. So thinking about identity, again, I'll just go through this quickly so we can kind of get to the last part, realizing that identity itself, just like culture, is multifaceted. So when you think about your own identity, you can think about it's not just, race, it's not just gender, or what you do for a living or any of that. Nationality is many, many things. And this is just a sampling. And these intersect in different ways. And they can also intersect with the greater, well, they do intersect with the greater culture and sociocultural context, so that there are power dynamics as well. So somebody's one identity may be privileged over another identity in a given circumstance, which can lead to certain tensions or difficulties in communication, whether it's teaching and learning or other types of communication. So this is another image to talk about this, and I'll be happy for Barbara to share these slides with you later if you would like them. But just thinking about identity is not only internal, but it also is in relationship to the external environment and to bigger things like the organizations that we're involved in, and even our historical time frame, right? So many things, like especially with learners who are navigating complex issues related to socioeconomic status or immigration status, they're coming to you not only with themselves and their culture, but all of that is also coming with them. As I mentioned before, acculturation is really the process of, being in dialogue with and changing in relationship to a new culture. It's not necessarily assimilation, which would mean to leave behind the past culture, but it's getting used to and familiar with the new culture so that you can kind of toggle back and forth, code switch, if you will, go from one context to another, or it may actually change an individual's identity. But in the process of acculturation, you will have culture shock. Guaranteed that will happen. And I bet many of you, if not all of you, have gone through that, whether it's with a completely different culture, like you lived abroad for several years, or even just went on a 2-week trip somewhere. It can happen in that short of a time frame. But it can happen like when you go to a new job or when students go to college. These same kind of cycle will happen. And I do emphasize that is a cycle. It will happen more than once for your learners, and it may kind of flare up during times of stress. So you start out where everything is exciting and new. So maybe your learner comes to literacy volunteers, they're going to learn English, they're super excited. And then they're starting to get frustrated because they don't really understand, when they're supposed to meet, or they lost their tutor's phone number, and then they kind of withdraw, right? And then they surface again. Then they come back and they're trying again. And then again, there might be a cycle where they're kind of coming to grips with maybe resentment that they have to learn a new language, or they don't have a strong schooling background. And this is really hard for them. It's fatiguing, actually physically fatiguing. And so you can expect kind of that uneven response depending on the gulf of difference between the initial culture and the new culture. And so for some students, it's super smooth. It's not a big deal, but for others, it could be huge, in addition to everything else they are dealing with. But eventually, if the relationship with the new culture persists, there will be adaptation and even perhaps assimilation. I don't personally think that's the goal. I think we want to retain the original identity as much as possible, but at least acculturation and the ability to thrive in the new culture. Any questions about this?
Yeah, this is so true.
Yeah.
I've got a group that recently formed, and I wanted to emphasize the role of grammar, and I had several sessions of grammar, and after a while, I felt like I was about ready to have a little bit of a revolt on my hands, okay, because they wanted to jump right on into conversational English. And I said, well, I think you really should have a little bit of time learning the rules of grammar. So we have reached a compromise that my 2-hour session is that the first part will be conversation, and then the next hour is going to be grammar. So I'm not going to cut out grammar because that's important to me, and I think that they need to have that. So
Yeah.
I see your curve going in there, and it's just like going into a new job.
Yep.
Forming, norming, conforming. It's like, okay, it just like the job. You're going
That's
to be going
true.
through those ups and downs on it until you start getting normalized. So, thank
Absolutely.
you. This is so true.
It definitely is true. And for those of you who have been through it, you know that it is a very emotional experience and it is physically tiring, like I mentioned. So what you were describing about negotiation and kind of compromise is a really great strategy because you're the teacher, what's going to help the student advance. You have that long-term view, you have the deep knowledge of the language and how students will do well with that. But the student also is kind of grappling with, well, what is how am I intersecting with this? Is this what I want? Is this going to meet my objectives? How do I stay motivated?
Yeah.
So
Well, we all remember those days of us having to learn grammar, and we'd rather be doing something different.
Probably.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so these are some common symptoms of culture shock. And so you can see one of those there is poor time management, remoteness or isolation. So those are things that can definitely surface. It doesn't mean we want to say, oh, that's fine. right? Like it is important that the learner acculturate to thrive in the new culture, right? Like that's part of the reason they're learning English, or trying to get their citizenship, is they want to be successful. They want to feel fulfilled. They want to be connected as part of the community. So we don't want to be like, oh, well, you're having culture shock, don't come back. But it is about having that perspective and patience with them to some degree. So as we kind of move over to the intercultural communication piece, the reason we start with culture is because culture and communication are inseparable. So the way we communicate is very culturally embedded. It is something, it's like a code we share, and a lot of times it's below the surface. We don't even realize it. But you realize that if you're abroad and going through culture shock and you see somebody from your home country, you may have nothing in common otherwise, but you see them and you're like, oh my gosh, and it's like that instant connection. And so you can think of the opposite of that. Your learner may be feeling a lot of alienation because they're not part of that code yet. So we do want to support identities and experiences and bring that in as much as possible, being sensitive to what our learners may be going through. And that's just part of that successful relationship building that, at least for me, when I was tutoring a lot, that was the best part for me, was getting to know the learners and just learning about their experiences and helping them. And hopefully that's what's really exciting to you as well. So at this point, we'll shift over to thinking about how to overcome barriers to intercultural communication and getting into some of those facets of culture as well that may help you articulate what is going on in a particular situation. Feel free to chime in at any point or ask questions or share your experiences as well. So as I mentioned, we can never, ever know all the details and rules of every single culture, let alone how the individual will manifest that. So a better approach is really to examine on a general level the barriers to intercultural communication and allow space for the individual case. And so the barriers we're going to focus on are anxiety, assuming similarity instead of difference, ethnocentrism, and stereotypes and prejudice. There are other barriers, of course. Language is a barrier, and that's kind of the one we're really trying to overcome with literacy volunteers. And nonverbal is part of that language. But I want to focus on these four. So, and our goal is to get beyond the barriers. So we talk about barriers not to emphasize them, but to say there's a way to deal with this. So often the first layer of anxiety will impede communication because, first of all, anxiety can affect language acquisition. So it's important to lower that affective barrier and anxiety in the teaching-learning relationship so we can anticipate it in ourselves and in our learners as well. Especially they will be unsure of expectations. They may feel really self-conscious, embarrassed because their language skills are not where they would like them to be. They're certainly not where they are in their native language, right? Their first language. And they may start to avoid interaction. So this is a big barrier at the first level before that relationship gets built. So we can think of strategies of how do we allay these feelings? How do we set up more security? How do we make expectations clear? And make it okay to be awkward, right? Because we're all new to something at some point. Assuming similarity instead of difference, this is just a silly photo, but we have to, again, this is the self-reflection piece where we're thinking, okay, I can't assume I know what my learner needs. I have to really find out. And that can be part of that anxiety diminishing because we're valuing the other person's perspective and asking them those questions to the best of our ability, depending on the language level, and finding out how to adjust our own style of teaching, our own behaviors in order to better meet them where they are. So when you were talking about negotiating, like, okay, we'll do a little bit of grammar and we'll do more conversation. That's kind of, one of those, if we had assumed similarity, oh, everybody wants to learn grammar, or they think it's important, we wouldn't get to a productive place in the teaching and learning relationship.
So true.
Ethnocentrism, we all are familiar with this term, but sometimes we just don't notice it showing up. And I have found in myself that my ethnocentrism will show up in things that it's not like about, oh, my culture is the best culture. Like, it's not that conscious. It's much more subconscious. So for example, when I lived in Brazil, I used to get really mad at when I go to the grocery store and I go to park and everybody was not parked in spaces. Like, they were parked, there were spaces to park in, but everyone was parked like at angles. And one day I came out of the grocery store and my car was actually encircled by other cars that were parked randomly. And I just could not grapple with this. I was like, there are lines, you need to park in the lines. And that anger I felt later on, I realized, oh my gosh, I'm being ethnocentric, right? Like, I'm assuming that for whatever reason, and I still am very connected to this assumption, by the way. So I haven't, evolved completely, but like, I'm thinking you need to park in the lines. But what were the reasons that people weren't parking in the lines? Like, I didn't seek to find that out. I just, had my, righteous anger about the parking. So, so this isn't like, fascist ethnocentrism. This is like very subtle things that we might get angry and upset about because we have an assumption at some level that our way is a better way. And so just keep on the outlook for that, because that can become a barrier. And this is just another cartoon. This is an extreme example, but you have to think about cultural relativism, and what we think is right or wrong. It really depends on our perspective. And so being very entrenched in one perspective or another will impede communication and can actually just make a relationship and dialogue impossible. Same thing with language, which language is most important. We have to recognize that there is a huge global preference for English right now, right? Like, English is the lingua franca, but by that term, you realize that it wasn't always the main language, right? Maybe it was Latin or maybe French, which is lingua franca, right? So that universal language that other people feel pressure to learn around the entire globe, it's, we can't assume that it's just a natural thing, right? Like, there's a lot of reasons why English has risen to its current position internationally. I think a lot of, we know about stereotypes, we know about prejudice. I'm not going to belabor that, but I think it's important to know that stereotypes and prejudice can also, people can internalize that against themselves. So I don't know if you've heard of the term stereotype threat, but that is when somebody, because of exposure to stereotypes over and over again, that they start to believe that they embody that, and then their behaviors become affected by that. So an example of stereotype threat was done in an experiment where men and women at a college took a math test, and there's a stereotype, I don't know if it's still out there very strongly, but that women are not as good at math as men, right? And so something in the test would foreground the gender, like in the experimental model. And when that gender was foregrounded, women tended to do worse on the test than they would have if it wasn't foregrounded. So it was like seeing the effects, the very real effects of a stereotype being internalized by someone. So your learners may be dealing with the stereotypes that they're facing, not from you, but from just the general kind of air they breathe. maybe microaggressions that they've experienced, which are like little things like, oh, your clothes are so unusual or something like that, which may feel like, why am I weird? Or like, what are people thinking about me? They may have internalized that. And, I just always caution people, if you're really convinced about something, maybe you need to consider like your own bias or any kind of perception that you have. It's very relative to your circumstances. So these are just some definitions. I'll share these slides so that you can look at them individually. But we don't really have time. This is what I mentioned about microaggression. That might be a term you're not as familiar with. It's unintentional, but it can make people of a marginalized group really feel even more marginalized. Okay, any questions so far? I think we're on track with time still. So I'm going to talk now about the Hofstede dimensions and nation state cultures, because that tends to be what we talk about. We tend to say, oh, my learner's from Mexico or from Haiti or Ukraine or China. That's still a really important kind of grouping that we use to understand culture. And Hofstede refers to a study that was done really in business cultures, and it was back mostly in the 1980s, but where they studied like companies that were multinational and different attitudes and differences across nation states. They're not perfect, kind of categories, but they do draw our attention to some of the main patterns that are seen across different nation state cultures. And those may manifest in your learners as part of their active culture. I find it just kind of like almost like different parameters that you can think about without, drawing the false conclusion that, oh, you're from this country, that means you are a collectivist, or, whatever term is used. Like, again, we have to be really cautious about making those assumptions, but being aware that, well, it's common in these countries to have a collectivist perspective where the group is more important than the individual. I wonder if that's affecting why my learner keeps canceling to take care of their mom or their kids. Again, it's just a tool in your toolbox. So this is, again, when we talk about cultural identity, a lot of people have that tendency to be like, well, I'm American, or I'm a New Yorker, or whatever it is. So in terms of thinking about those groups, national identity is important. So these are some of the cultural dimensions that Hofstede identified in his study. And again, when I share the slides, I offer different definitions of all of these, but I think most of them are fairly self-explanatory. I'll do very quickly, a summary of what they are. So power distance index tends to be about authority, and kind of the teacher-learner relationship can be in there. So like, how much authority does a teacher have, and like how much can a student speak up, right? Like, what's the distance between the person in power and the person who doesn't have power. So in certain cultures that could be very high, and that may lead your learner to be more reticent or passive. Individualism and collectivism I just referred to. The United States is off the charts on individualism. We are like the highest ranking in the entire world. And thinking about why somebody goes to improve their English or might have career aspirations, like, we're going to automatically, most likely, depending on your active culture, but it's very likely given our dominant culture that you will highly prize the individual trajectory, right? And collectivist really thinks about the group first. And so you may encounter many cultures that are collectivist, and will not put the individual first. Uncertainty avoidance index is just what it sounds like. So how much risk is okay, how much uncertainty is okay. Masculinity versus femininity is really about certain behaviors that, like, a more masculine culture might prize aggressiveness or decision making. Not to say that that's what is actually masculine or feminine for actual people, but just those categories that were used by Hofstede. Long-term orientation versus short-term orientation we'll go into a little bit more, so I won't talk about that as much, but that is like, how far ahead do we think, and how does that orient our behaviors? Indulgence versus restraint, I think you can understand as well. But like, how much are we thinking about in the moment versus I'm going to hold back certain behaviors to achieve a longer term goal? So a lot of times these are kind of interacting with each other in a given culture. All right. So again, it'll go through some of these definitions.
Excuse me,
Sorry.
could you explain again power distance index?
Sure. Yeah, let me see if it comes up here. Oops. So power distance index, let me see if it'll come up with the definition here when I go through these. Yeah, okay, here it is. So in this case, thinking about how less powerful members of society expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. And so I was really focusing on the teacher-learner relationship. So if it's normal that there's a big distance between the powerful and the powerless, like I put the GINI coefficient there, that's wealth inequality. So for example, in Brazil, where I lived for several years, it was common to see like a fancy neighborhood right next to, like, you know, shacks and what we call a favela or kind of a slum right next to each other, because there was such a high level of inequality, and that was normal, right? And there was this sense of, oh, the more powerful people are very distant from the less powerful. And we might not see that as much in the United States, right? Like there's not an expectation like, oh, you know, an authority figure has so much authority, I could never question, I could never speak up, I could never talk to the teacher or whatever. Yeah, but in a lot of cultures, there is that sense of reverence even of a teacher. Maybe hard for us to comprehend here, but yeah, and like Keuka College has partnerships with China and Vietnam, and we definitely see that when the students come to the United States to do part of their degree, they're not necessarily used to, especially students from China, being able to speak up in class or being asked what they think about something, right? They're just looking to kind of absorb the knowledge. And so that's part of that power distance as well.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? So you can, you know, obviously Google this Hofstede cultural dimensions. It's really interesting. Again, it's just one framework. There are other frameworks out there to help us compare different cultures and put labels to that. But I think it's helpful to just start to be aware of all the nuances of how cultural differences manifest. Here's another one.
May I ask a question before you go?
Yeah.
Sorry, it seems like some of the ways that power is being framed, I certainly have experienced that in Hungary and in Germany, but in Asian cultures, the reluctance to speak up is often not about a power differential, but respect.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
And
Yep.
so some of the ways I think that even in framing like masculine versus feminine cultures, that's also kind of an odd US centric maybe way of thinking of things, right? When we were talking about cultural, I can't remember the word you used, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. cultural dimensions or frameworks. Yeah.
Being ethnocentric, I think,
Oh, yes.
in the way that
Yeah.
these Hofstede's dimensions are being framed. It feels very ethnocentric in that way. And I
And
wondered
that's
if you
a
could,
valid critique. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, definitely a valid critique. And I think he has been critiqued for that, you know, that in itself, it may not, it may center what is more important in Northern Europe and the United States. So that's
Right.
a great point.
'Cause it seems like laughter in some cultures is a sign of discomfort, and in others, it's a sign of happiness. And you know, maybe the overall message of this Hofstede's dimension is just to check your assumptions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I share this as one kind of theory or study that was done, but it's by no means the only one. And it has flaws, like you mentioned, for sure. And so I think when we focus more on, you know, the things that I was talking about at the beginning to identify barriers and overcome those barriers and self-awareness, then we can really get to know firsthand the cultures we're interacting with. Whereas if we bring these frameworks too much, that can actually shut us down and just replicate the barriers we're trying to avoid. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'll give you these slides because I know we don't have time to go through every single definition. Okay. So this is just another visualization of these cultural dimensions, so that if we were to classify, again, a nation state culture as high power distance, or you know, low long-term orientation, then that would give you like very, very general terms of what you might expect, or it might help you understand what you're seeing. But it should not be applied like a rule, if that makes sense. I'm sure that you're also aware that along with language, nonverbal communication is huge, and it's one of those aspects of a language. When you're learning a language, it's very hard to also learn the nonverbal communication piece because it's a more unconscious, if you will, part of culture. So that may be something to think about in your interactions with learners. Eye contact, for example, gestures, tone of voice, even like the distance you sit from somebody, like what's a normal personal distance? Of course, that's been completely destroyed by COVID. But, you know, like some cultures like to get really close up and others prefer their space, like the personal bubble. And so all of that goes into the nonverbal communication. So finally we get to time, and I think we still have time to talk about this. Time orientation is, again, not a perfect descriptor, but can give you kind of awareness and maybe a general framework to start thinking about how different cultures approach time differently. I knew personally when I was living abroad, this was another one of those cultural edges that I came across very quickly. So I was teaching at a university in Brazil. It's my first day of class. I show up 10 minutes early, just like I normally would, and nobody was there. Not a student in the room. And then, you know, they started coming in around the time class started and up until maybe, say, 15 minutes after. And yeah, that kind of blew my mind. And then after I had lived abroad for several years and gotten used to that, I came back to Keuka College and it was my first day of class again. And I showed up right on time and every student was there waiting for me. So it was just an example of how I was kind of getting pulled and pushed by the monochronic time and polychronic time cultures. In the United States, we are definitely a monochronic time culture on the whole, although you're going to see generational differences and individual differences for sure. Time is definitely more tangible, linear, sequential, plans, schedules, deadlines, promptness, all of that matters a lot in the United States. In general, again, in general. Whereas polychronic time or P time, it's really about what somebody might be doing in the moment, like what they're engaged in. Their relationships are valued more than, say, a set schedule. Arriving late is much more normalized. You know, a kind of funny story about a learner here in Penn had invited me to her niece's birthday. And I knew they're from Mexico, so I'm not going to come at the time that they asked me. So I came like half an hour, 45 minutes late, and I was still the first person there. So, you know, like it was, I didn't quite grasp what their sense of time was. And that's something like you get to know with the individual. However, we go back to that acculturation conversation. It's not going to be productive or help your learner thrive if they're bringing too much P time to an M time culture. Like they have to learn the expectations that the United States has. Also, it's important to state that in a P time culture, even though in general, in personal relationships and maybe even in school, that's going to show up, things like doctor's appointments or bus schedule, like those are still very real. So it's not as though there's just the absence of order or something like that, but it's a lot more flexible and fluid and even forgiving, I would say, around time. Any questions about this or critiques or?
No, but this is a big issue, as you
Yeah.
know, because the first time you gave this presentation, that this was a big point for the tutors who participated, because this was during COVID. And most of my tutors were meeting remotely. And because they sent out Zoom links for their sessions, the learners had to be punctual. And it was a real problem. It was a real problem. And this was a very helpful segment of your presentation. It really was very helpful. It made the tutors feel better. It really did.
Right. Because there is a tendency for when things don't go as we expect to take it personally and like also think about, well, what did I do wrong? Or what could I do better? Or to say that person doesn't respect me. They don't care. They're not invested. And it's probably more complicated than that.
I think it is complicated.
Yeah.
But that helped. At least it wasn't that the learner wasn't interested or wasn't interested in learning or wasn't committed to working with the tutor. It was just a different framework, perhaps. It just gave them something. It gave them so.
Nancy, I see your hand is up. It's good to see you.
So we have our ESL class down in Penn and we've had it for a long time. And when we started, no one came on time. I even asked folks, is it better if we switch to a different night? Should we start later? No, they all wanted the same time. We have now learned, thanks to Liz, we run the class from 5:30 to 7:30. People can come when they want because that's what seems to work best. And then tutors just have to accept it and be willing to sit around and wait for their learner to come if their learner doesn't come on time. So I guess the problem's solved, but we never do get people there at 5:30.
Celine, did you have a question too?
I thank you. I would just chime in that as someone who's lived in a lot of non-white communities for long stretches of time, that what you describe about punctuality is kind of a white cultural value, a cultural sauce, and that often there's something known as CPT, colored people time, that people of color tend to have a different way of valuing punctuality, and that even the expectation that my learner is going to show up at a certain time, or that we're never changing the date, or, you know, there's kind of a rigidity that we rely upon. We don't think of it as being rigid. We think of it as being scheduled, because there are real consequences, as you note, with doctor's appointments. But on the other side of it, it looks really rigid and uptight, because like, what's the consequence, right? So I think it's, again, one of those places that enriches our lives when we're exposed to people who do things differently, even though we're still really attached to having it done the way we want it to be done.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, again, one of those examples of, you know, this is the dominant culture, and the dominant culture right now is the white culture, right? Like in the United States. So definitely within the United States and that nation state culture, there are so many co-cultures and subcultures, and they have different time orientations as well. That's a great point. And I completely agree that when we let go of some of our assumptions and, you know, this rigidity, then we are all potentially enriched. But I do see it as a dialogue as well. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, so we're almost at time. So I will send the slides so you can look at this, but this is basically the same thing about monochronic time and polychronic time. Another interesting thing are low context and high context cultures. So a lower context culture will tend to be very specific, detailed, precise in communication, like say everything. And that's because these cultures don't necessarily have a lot of shared knowledge or understanding. So you have to kind of say everything, and may not be as good as reading body language and so forth. Whereas a high context culture may not say as much, because there's a greater shared understanding. There may be a more consideration of nonverbals, feelings of others, and that relationship piece. So I wanted to open up space. I know we're pretty much at time, but any additional concerns about time and commitment that are coming up for you in your teaching and learning situations? Hopefully, as a result of reflecting on these topics today, there you have a little bit another way to look at it, but also remembering that your learner may need more clarity, more direction, or explicit information about what is expected from their commitment to being a learner and literacy volunteers. If they're from, let's say, a high context culture, they may think there's more shared understanding than there really is. If they're from a more polychronic culture, P time culture, they may think it's fine to cancel, right? Like, and maybe you can compromise and be more flexible, understanding about that. But we also have to realize that it's a back and forth relationship.
It is.
Yeah,
it is. It is. So thank you, Malia. If anybody has any questions, oh, look at this. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, that's fine. I'll just leave it on this slide, and I will be happy to share the slides as well.
That's what I was going to ask. Send the slides, and I will send them out to everybody who's here.
Yeah.
And I've also recorded, I guess successfully recorded this, so I will share the presentation with everybody. And also people who were not able to attend, who asked to have it recorded, because there were a fair number of people who couldn't attend. And if you have questions that you think of afterwards, you can send your questions to me, and I will forward them to Malia if you would like, or I will try to answer them myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
On this last slide, I put my email address. I'm happy to, either way, from Barbara or directly to me, I'd be happy to talk more with you about this. Again, it's a vast field and very complex in terms of all the nuances in individuals, but I hope that you are able to get something out of today, and I'd love to talk with you more.
Thanks, Malia. I really
Thank you, Malia.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Malia.
Yes,
Thank
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.